President Biden urging NATO leaders to ramp up their industrial production amid threats from China and Russia. And the U.S. rolling out a new move to prevent China from flooding U.S. markets. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao. Iris, good evening. What's President Biden saying at the NATO summit today?
Good evening to you, Jack. So as NATO leaders gather here in D.C. for their annual NATO summit, President Biden is calling on them to produce more defense equipment more quickly as Russia is making more weapons with the help from the Chinese communist regime. Here is President Biden speaking at a working session today. Watch.
They're significantly ramping up their production of weapons, munitions, and vehicles. And they're doing it with the help of China, North Korea, and Iran. We cannot, in my view, we cannot allow the alliance to fall behind.
And President Biden also highlights the tens of billions of dollars of investments that the U.S. is making in our domestic manufacturing. That says Biden in recent months has been warning about China's efforts to help Russia, including by supplying it with materials and equipment used in the war against Ukraine. Meanwhile, the NATO Secretary General today also emphasized the need to maintain a focus on the Indo-Pacific.
And we will reinforce our partnerships in the Indo-Pacific to push against the growing alignment of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea.
And in their final joint statement to be released this week, the NATO leaders are expected to call out China's efforts to help Russia and also the threat posed by China to Western countries. Meanwhile, President Biden this week, tomorrow on Thursday, will also hold a solo press conference at the NATO summit, and he's expected to cover both domestic and foreign topics. Back to you.
Well, Iris, there's definitely a lot of attention on that press conference tomorrow. We'll keep our eyes on that. But what did the U.S. today announce on the tariffs targeting China?
Right, so the Biden administration on Wednesday announced new tariffs targeting steel and aluminum routed through Mexico. And that's actually a step to prevent China from circumventing existing U.S. tariffs on its cheap and state-subsidized metals imported to the U.S. And that comes after President Biden in May tripled tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum directly imported from China to the U.S. And all these moves, U.S. officials say, are to prevent China from harming U.S. industrial workers, including the ones in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Back to you.
Iris, thank you for that. Congressional leadership from both parties meet with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy and NATO leaders in the Capitol. Our Washington correspondent, Luis Martinez, has the details of the high-profile meetings happening on the sidelines of the NATO summit.
A group of bipartisan senators led by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell met with NATO leaders this Wednesday morning on the sidelines of the NATO summit. Also this Wednesday morning, Secretary General of NATO Jens Stoltenberg praised the bipartisan nature of U.S. congressional supports towards NATO.
And in the U.S. Congress, there is strong bipartisan support for NATO. U.S. security interest is to have a strong NATO, strong bipartisan support, and that European allies are stepping up, investing more. I expect that the United States will remain a strong ally regardless of the outcome of the elections.
Speaker of the House Mike Johnson is also set to meet with NATO leaders, in particular Greek Prime Minister, the President of the Czech Republic, and the newly elected Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Senate leadership also met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy presented Senator Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell with the Medal of the Order of Merit First Class in recognition of their support of Ukraine. Zelenskyy also met with Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, but not all House Republicans were pleased with the Speaker's decision.
I think Speaker Johnson, instead of meeting with Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, should be more focused on doing everything he can to make sure the SAVE Act, which would protect our elections across the country, is made into a law. Speaker Johnson could be using his one of the most powerful positions in the country to do things like that instead of meeting with President Zelenskyy, talking about sending more of our hard-earned tax dollars over there. It's ridiculous.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy urged U.S. lawmakers not to wait until the November general elections to continue providing the necessary tools for Ukraine to counter Russian aggression. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
As NATO leaders are meeting in D.C. this week, how has the war in Ukraine influenced European perceptions of their own security? Well, joining me is James Gilmore, former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, to discuss the geopolitical concerns of the Ukraine conflict and U.S. national security. Ambassador James Gilmore, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for the chance to speak to your listeners.
As NATO's leaders gather in D.C. for the summit, how has the war in Ukraine influenced European fears and perceptions of security?
Well, I think that the Ukraine war has solidified Europe's outlook a great deal. Now we've seen that many more of the NATO countries are spending the 2% GDP commitment to defense. We're seeing a unification between all of the leaders. We've seen the growth of NATO through Finland and Sweden and rallying a great deal. So I think that that's what's going on. I think they do count on the United States being a part of this whole overall program, and I know that we are.
Is the defense spending enough that NATO's receiving from each nation?
Not yet, but I think that politically, Vladimir Putin needs to perceive what is going on. He has to ask himself the question, can he achieve his political goals through military violence, atrocity, aggression, and conquest? The longer that this goes on and there's more solidification of the Western alliance, I think it becomes clearer and clearer that he can't do that. He can defeat any one country in Europe, but he can't defeat every country in Europe, and he certainly can't defeat the United States, and the United States being a part of NATO.
What specific concerns do you have regarding the nuclear threats from Russia?
It's very hard to believe that Vladimir Putin would cross that red line. What's he going to really achieve on the battlefield other than poisoning the entire Central European continent, including, by the way, Russia, as the winds blow that way? So I don't think he's going to do that. It has to be taken seriously because he's committed to his political goals. But we have to be just as resolute to not allow him to achieve his political goals, either through military force, violence, nuclear weapons, or diplomacy.
What are the strategic implications for the U.S. Of the emerging alliance between China, Russia, and Iran, and North Korea?
I believe what we're seeing is an emerging group of people that believe in their own self-interest, that they want to upset the Western order and, in fact, the international order that's happened after World War II, where we reject aggression and conquest and violence and the things that we saw in World War II. All of that now is back up on the table. And China and Russia and even traveling to that silly country, North Korea, all of that, in my view, by the way, demonstrates not strength of this group, but weakness. I don't think that the Russians have the capacity to continue this war. I think that's why Vladimir Putin is seeking a ceasefire. That's why he wants a negotiated settlement, Vladimir Putin, because he knows he can't win on the battlefield. Again, everything has to be focused on is that these are political goals that are being sought by Putin and by all these other countries. But as long as the West is committed to its values and committed to its defense, I believe we're going to be fine. But we have to have strong leadership to be able to do that.
And does the United States need to increase its defense spending to significantly beef up the American national security right now?
My own view is that this is a moment when we can handle the situation and handle Putin with the resources that we have at our disposal and the disposal of our allies. I believe we can do that. But if we falter at this moment, I'm confident at that point that this is going to get out of hand. And we're going to end up having to actually defend ourselves much more aggressively, much more strongly. And that means, frankly, that we may very well have to go to a war economy. We may have to begin that process now. Putin's already done that. He's made the commitment as to a war economy, to the application of his oil resources to his military. He knows what he intends to do. We now have to be just as resolute, and we have to, I think, begin to prepare for the situation if it gets further out of hand. But I want to emphasize this is the moment when this can all be averted. A third world war can be stopped, can be averted now, if we have decisive American leadership in conjunction with our Western allies.
Ambassador James Gilmore, thank you very much for your time here today.
Good, thank you very much.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.